Hello and welcome to the second Scribe conversation. I'm really thrilled to see you all here on this wet and cold February day. I hope that you are able to walk out of here feeling more encouraged, more equipped, able to face the challenges of seminary and ministry and life with a little bit more confidence and security. So I'm very excited with our panelists here today. We've got Dr. Robert Kim, Professor Sabrina Hickel, and Dr. Jay Sklar here to share their wisdom, experience, and thoughts on the issue of imposter syndrome. If this is a phrase you haven't heard before, it's basically the idea of someone in a situation where they are being judged on their abilities to perform, but they feel like they are only there because they have somehow fooled everyone, that they really shouldn't be there at all, that they're going to be found out. It may also be experienced as feelings of inadequacy or shame. Has anyone, I won't make you raise your hand, but maybe in your head, does anyone identify with these feelings? I do. I have felt like that, absolutely. In fact, probably right now a little bit. All right, just to be completely transparent there. So this is talking about when you feel you don't belong. So I'd like to start out by putting everyone in the hot seat and asking them to share a time when they have felt like they have not been adequate to a task, when there's been feelings of inadequacy, a fear of failure. Maybe share what that felt like, how it affected what you were able to do or the opportunities you were able to take hold of. Maybe was there anyone who came alongside you during that time that helped you gain a clearer perspective, or just walk through those emotions together? What happened? So whoever would like to, please.
Sure, I'll start just because I'm right next to it. So I think based upon that question, my most formidable kind of moment like that was when I was doing my doctoral ministry degree. And I'm sure Joel, since he's here, as the director of the Demon program, can attest to a lot of students who have felt this. But there's always a point in the middle of your dissertation where you're doing all this research and you're doing all this writing, and you're like, you're really passionate about this particular subject, but you don't know if it's going to make any sense of contribution at all. So I got to a point where it was definitely like writer's block, lack of confidence, not wanting to do it, just kind of be an ABD, all but dissertation, and just kind of say, it's not worth trying to get through this. So I talked with one of my advisors, or my dissertation advisor, and he actually happened to relocate from Florida, actually right next to where I was in Jersey. And so I was able to just drive over and just kind of have a lunch with him. And just him just speaking words of encouragement, kind of saying, Robert, your unique perspective is absolutely just, it's critical for us to be able to hear your voice. And as you write your words on paper, it's contribution with respect to kind of this, much of the conversations that were going around regarding kind of my topic on dissertation. And just kind of hearing an older person who is obviously behind you, wanting to support you, encourage you, value that, believing probably perhaps more in what I believed in myself, but kind of just rooting it on. So his simple kind of word of counsel was literally just get her done, right? And the was ER, right? It's like just get her done. And that's how we ended. And literally I went back, and then that's when I finished. And so that's kind of my quick story behind it. But there's a lot of kind of deep-seated doubt in the midst of all that.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. I have two. They kind of go together with how I got help afterwards. I'm a counselor, and I often am counseling people and thinking, they're going to find out I don't know what I'm doing. And I have no idea what theory to use or therapy to use at all. And when I was promoted to being an internship supervisor, I felt that same way. My students are going to find out that I should not be in this position at all. I was so scared. I was writing down things that they were saying that I didn't know what they were, so I could look them up on Google and Wikipedia later. Then I went to a faculty meeting with the MAC faculty, and Dr. Winter, the founder of our counseling program, was there, and Dr. Zink, our director, and we were all saying to each other, in fact, they started the conversation and said, this thing is going on in my family, and I don't know how to help. I feel like such a fraud. And I said, really? You too? You too? And that helped me to realize I wasn't alone. And that's one of the things that research shows on imposter syndrome is one of the best ways to fight it is to be with other people who feel the same way. So that was so cool. It's cool that happened for both of us.
Thanks, Sabrina. I think for me, there are lots of different times I could think of, but the one that comes to mind in this context was my first year teaching here. And my first year teaching here, I had come out of a PhD program right to here. And I remember one of my first classes was actually in this room. I had just spent 3.5 years studying Leviticus, and I came here, and one of the first classes I had to teach was on the historical books. And I was like, oh yeah, there is something in the Bible past the Pentateuch. Joshua, yeah, that's my brother, but that's a book too. I've heard of this before. And in one semester, I had to try and teach this class. And I was used to being in an academic context and feeling like I was doing well. And now I was in an academic context teaching this class, feeling totally overwhelmed, and coming out of some classes thinking C minus, maybe. Shall I really be here? Am I supposed to be doing this? And what happened partway through that semester is I remember the thought just coming as though the Holy Spirit drove a grace-filled dagger into me. And the thought was, you know, Jay, the Lord loves you just as much now in what you're feeling as failure as he did a year ago in what you were feeling as success. And I almost felt like I became a Christian. I mean, it was that new to me, that the Lord's unconditional love became that real to me. Now, don't worry, I was a Christian. They hire Christians here for professors. But it just became so alive and fresh. And so I think sometimes with the imposter syndrome, sometimes it's actually just recognizing, yeah, I might not be as strong as I thought I was or would hope to be, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because God loves me just as much.
Thank you all for sharing. As this conversation goes on, you may find things are said that resonate with you or that we pass over and you want to hear more about. I would like to mention that at the end of today, like in the last 10, 15 minutes, we're going to have a Q&A. So feel free to write down your questions or save them up. We'll pass this mic around at that time. Or if you are watching online, because we do have some of our online students joining us today, that they can write into scribe@covenantseminary.edu. That's our email address, scribe, SCRIBE, @covenantseminary.edu. And to anyone in the room, if you'd like to participate in the Q&A anonymously, email us. So we'd love to hear your voices at the end of our conversation here today. So it might be that one of these stories was something that you felt like, I think I have something in common here and I want to hear more about, or any part of the conversation that comes up. Keep your questions in mind. It's a conversation not just up here, but here too. And hopefully one that will go on with your classmates throughout the weeks to come here at Covenant. So I heard some of you share about how there were people who were kind of authorities or, you know, your advisor, couple steps in front of you, hopefully, and able to look back and affirm that, no, you belong here, keep working, keep swimming, keep going, or kind of having a reality check with God of like, who am I in your sight and what am I supposed to be doing? Is it based on like what I accomplish? What does success look like? I actually connected with that one when I was in grad school. I was actually really fortunate to start attending a church where there was this one message the pastor kept saying about how Christ's righteousness is given to us as our own, which like that's not too surprising, if you're sitting here. But it was something that I needed to have sink in. And I started switching the word righteousness for rightness whenever I heard it, because that was the way that I needed it to get into my brain, that if I'm not always right, if I don't always have the right question or answer, or my argument gets shot down, because that happened during presentations and stuff while in grad school, that Christ did have it right, and that my report card was having my name taken off and Jesus' name put on top, and he was taking all my right answers, or all my wrong answers, and taking all the responsibility and liability for those on himself, and that Jesus' report card had my name at the top. Was this image that just, it sounds kind of silly, little story, but it made a huge difference in being able to walk back into that classroom every day, being able to turn in that paper that I knew I had some learning to do, but it was due. So just being able to take that next step. In a way, somehow that defines humility for me, because the idea of growing in humility and also understanding and processing our feelings of inadequacy, for me, were very closely linked. So I wanted to ask where you may see connections or growth from shame to humility, or from shame to understanding who you are as a child of God. Just how did that play out for you, or have you learned how that may play out for people?
I can start.
The counselor.
Oh, I don't know if the counselor should go first. One of the questions Katie asked us ahead of time is, how do you define humility? For me, this comes down to who do I know my identity to be, and does it help me do two things? One is forego the opportunity to celebrate myself when I'm given the chance. And the second is to celebrate the good things that other people do without feeling inadequate and without comparing myself. We know comparison is the thief of all joy. And when we are comparing, it leads to that imposter syndrome, because we're comparing what we know of ourselves on the inside with what we see of other people on the outside. And so with that definition of humility for me, and I am still working on it every day, am I so secure in who I am? And of course, we know as believers, our identity is in Christ. Am I so secure in that identity that I can forego celebrating myself, and then I can celebrate other people, because then I don't have to compare myself to them. And then I can be just secure in who I am and delight in their gifts. And that cuts down on that sense of fraud. Not completely, but a good bit. No, nothing?
I won't improve. I will echo that sentiment, though, of comparison. So obviously, most of you in this room know that I'm new to the seminary, and when I compare myself to the rest of the faculty, it's like the question could be, actually, if you play the old childhood game, which one doesn't belong? And so there are times in which I will feel kind of that sentiment kind of flood over my heart and myself. But it's kind of that reminder, though, again, of, I think, even as Jay mentioned, the Lord's providence in terms of how he brings you to where you are, to be rooted in the gospel. And so, even when I was mentoring other seminary students in Philadelphia, I would always say this to them, preach the gospel to yourself. And it's funny, even all the more so now in my role, how much that's true for me. That, before I teach or before I interact with people, being kind of rooted in the gospel and that understanding, just helps overcome a lot of those things in terms of comparison. The only other thing I'll just mention with respect to humility, so I looked up a definition just for fun, and it was free from pride or arrogance is one way to define humility. But I think the way that you worded the question in the document was somewhere down the lines of, how does it play in comparison to where there could be level of false humility with respect to writing? And this is another, I think, struggle to be able to even say, your voice, so some of the times I think we might be afraid in terms of this idea of imposter syndrome to write, because, we're like, oh, I don't want to sound like the expert or, someone who's there to kind of boast in that. At the same time, part of my culture background would say that, we always kind of do a level of deference. And so to say, well, someone else has the right answer, and I can kind of just defer to that. So I'm also fighting against that kind of struggle to be able to say that deference isn't necessarily a good posture either, that the Lord has given a voice and words to be able to speak and represent, in particular, that part of God's creation.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing it back to writing.
Yeah.
So this event is hosted by the Scribe Writing Center. We live in the library, and we would love to meet you all face to face. So a lot of times this experience of imposter syndrome can occur during a writing process, particularly if you have perhaps procrastinated on a paper or realized, I could have started this 2 weeks ago, and now it's due in 2 days, and I guess it's going to be what it's going to be. And sometimes that's just because we all have very busy lives, and we can only fit so much stuff in. And sometimes there can be processes by which we may trick ourselves into not doing something so that when you get 2 days ahead, you can say, well, I only have 2 days left to do this. It's going to be what it's going to be. And you don't have to own up to the fact of how it can really be a struggle to research, to write, to figure out what your ideas are. So I had asked our panel a question ahead of time about how we may mask our feelings of inadequacy through procrastination. Some of you may have read Richard Winter's book, Perfecting Ourselves to Death. When I was in graduate school and my husband was an MDiv here, he told me to read this book. That's what he thought I needed. But one of the things that Dr. Winters points out in it is that sometimes we'll tell ourselves that it's better to be blamed for lack of efficiency than lack of ability. So beyond tips like staying off of Facebook or putting the phone away, because sometimes that is the problem when it comes to procrastinating, how can we understand the underlying struggle that some procrastinators face? This may be something that you've experienced yourself, or just you might have insight into the whole process by which that works.
Yeah, so why do we procrastinate? Or if you're in a situation where you find yourself procrastinating, by which we mean not life's so busy that you can't get to something. We mean you have the chance to get to it, but you put it off for some reason. And I think most of us in this room have been there with one thing or another in our life. There are certain things that we procrastinate on. And I think it's actually helpful to ask ourselves 4 different questions in terms of procrastination. And we might find that the answer is not just one of the 4. Often it's a mix of these 4. But the 4 questions I'd ask would be this. If I'm procrastinating, I'm trying to figure out why am I doing this, then I could ask, well, is it just because I don't have a strong work ethic? I mean, like across the board, I just don't like to work hard. That could be one answer. The Proverbs talks about this. You know, a little folding of the hands, a little slumber, poverty will come on you like an armed bandit, right? The sluggard. But a second question to ask is, am I procrastinating because I'm working in an area that is outside of my strengths? So for me, for example, I'm writing a commentary right now on the book of Exodus, and in Exodus there's a lot of geography. And I am just so weak. I'm pathetic when it comes to geography. I mean, up until very recently, I literally would have to think, never eat shredded wheat to keep east and west separate, right? And so when I come up on something in Exodus that's going to involve geography, it's going to be very easy for me to procrastinate because it's outside an area of strength. Does that make sense? A third reason we procrastinate is because we do struggle with perfectionism in some way or other. And we're afraid, we'd rather not do it than do it in an imperfect way. And a final reason we procrastinate can be related to not just working outside an area of strength or not wanting to be perfect. It can be because we just don't see the usefulness, the purpose of what we've been asked to do. Why in the world do I have to memorize third declension nouns? When there's software, I can just point and click, and it will be right there. Why am I doing this? Right? And asking those 4 questions is actually really helpful, because with each of them, you want to take a different approach to overcoming procrastination. If it's just, I don't have a strong work ethic, then that's something to really pray about. And even to repent over. The scriptures associate hard work and wisdom. God's created us to work hard, right? If it's that it's outside an area of strength, then you might tell yourself on the one hand, take up David's words, I will not sacrifice to the Lord that which costs me nothing. Lord, this is not an area of strength for me, but because I want to glorify you, I'm going to put the work in here. Or you might tell yourself, yeah, it's not an area of strength, so I'm going to start there while I'm freshest, and I'm going to reward myself by, when I'm done, I get to do X, Y, and Z. Right? Go play FIFA or whatever it would be. If it's perfectionism, then that's again a matter really to bring to the Lord and ask him, help me, Lord, to understand that you don't ask me to be perfect, you ask me to be faithful. And depending on the depth of that struggle, it might mean going to a counselor to get some advice on really how to overcome that kind of struggle in particular. And if it's, I don't see the utility of this, then it may be going to your professor and ask it, why do I have to memorize these third declension nouns? I don't see, and trying to get some help to see, okay, yeah, there is a reason that my professor's asking me to do this. It's kind of like if you've ever seen The Karate Kid, wax on, wax off. Have you seen this movie? He's learning a martial art, and all day long he's just got to wax this car, wax on, and he just can't see the utility of it. Why am I? And at the end of the day, his teacher comes up and starts jabbing at him, and lo and behold, he knows exactly what to do. Third declension nouns are kind of like that. There's this long term. But anyway, you ask your professor and try and get some insight. So if you're struggling with procrastination, try and ask yourself, is it rooted in one of those 4 things? And if so, how do I begin to tackle it?
I promise what I'm going to say next does not contradict what Jay just said. But sometimes with procrastination, we actually need to procrastinate more. Now, bear with me when I say that, and let me give a little bit of context. Don't hear what I'm not saying. Procrastination can have some benefits if we are actually really intentional when we are doing it. And we use it for play and for rest to revive ourselves, refresh ourselves, rejuvenate. I think of the principle of the Sabbath. Dan Doriani taught me this, that the Sabbath is not just made for those of us who are perfectionists and workaholics like me, recovering workaholic, who tend to want to work 7 days a week. The Sabbath gives us that day of rest. It tells us procrastination or rest is really important. The Sabbath principle also tells us if we're the sluggard that we should work hard 6 days a week. And so balancing with what Jay said, sometimes we need that rest in order to be rejuvenated to work on a project, in order to have energy for it, in order to go learn what we don't know. That's one of the hallmarks of what some of the most successful CEOs do when it comes to this imposter syndrome, is they know that what they don't know and they go learn it. And they spend time not pretending, but actually asking people to help educate them. And so sometimes that procrastination or that extra time spent intentionally can be really important. I hope I didn't contradict anything you just said.
Amen.
Amen. Okay.
I won't add to anything because I think Jay did a great job of his 4-question analysis. But maybe one question for Jay is, what state do the Kansas City Chiefs play in? I'm just go ahead.
Okay then. So one thing that Jay just shared about was recognizing a difference between faithfulness as a student and perfection as a student. Some of us might come out of maybe straight out of high school or straight out of a, well, I guess not straight out of high school, but Maybe you were a religion major or philosophy major and you land with both feet on the ground in seminary and start running. Or maybe that's how you feel like all of your classmates did it. And maybe you have been out of school for a long time. Maybe you've always felt like school and you didn't quite mesh, but somehow you have been led here to continue studying at the graduate level at seminary. Like, oh my goodness. Maybe you think you're a slow reader. That's me. Maybe writing is just hard. One thing I like to remind people at the Scribe, that when writing is hard, that means that you're learning. That means that you're being forced to build bridges, that you're creating connections. If it's really, really easy to write, sometimes that's good. And sometimes it means that you already know this stuff, and if you really want to be challenging yourself and moving forward, you should be doing something harder. So if you are being challenged, that means not that this is way over your head and beyond what you're able to do. This may actually mean that this is exactly where you're supposed to be so that you can be growing. So I'd like to ask our panelists for any commentary they have on what to them is a good student. What is faithfulness in studies as opposed to perfection? What does it look like, perhaps if it's not straight A's? Can you still be a good student and not have a 4.0? Please tell us. What does it mean when you think of who is a good student in your class?
I'll just start because limited experience, but I think in terms of the papers I've read and look at the writing, I've tried to grade it or examine it more on the faithfulness of the students who have put some of their critical thoughts in terms of actually going a little bit deeper than the cursory level of saying that they've actually just spent the time. I don't think in terms of fidelity with respect to kind of quote unquote the standards of good writing or what I'm actually trying to look for, but to try to get peer into the student's brain, or I guess as they wrote, in terms of saying, did they put in some of the deep work with respect to it? Grammatical and kind of those other things with regards to citations are not things that I overlook or I look too deeply at, but just trying to making sure that I've understood what the student is actually trying to get at. The only other thing that I'll say there is just maybe perhaps an anecdote is in terms of faithfulness is just to keep writing is important. So I'm a parent of 3. My younger 2 right now are in middle school, so they're kind of writing more extensive, essays, and it's fun just coming alongside them because as they're writing, for example, my daughter will say, "I have to write a 5-paragraph essay," and for most of us in this room, we laugh, but it's funny, like her, kind of just from what Katie just said, like it's hard for her, and she's getting there, and kind of seeing your progress even over the years. It's the same aspect of it. We're all growing as writers, we're all growing in that ability, and that to me is that piece of faithfulness to the student, is that we're all growing together with respect to this.
I like that. I tell the students in my class the same thing that I tell my children at home. All I expect is that you put in your best effort, and that will be good enough. In human growth and development, we teach about D.W. Willett, who coined the phrase "good enough mother." That all you need is to be good enough. We all in this room know that Jesus is the only one who's perfect. We can't ever be. We need to be faithful. We need to be good enough. And that's what I look for with my students. So if they're putting in a good old college try, doing their best, I don't care if they've got a B. I care what their effort is, and then we can grow from there together. And when they're honest about where they are and they don't hide, that is the best. Absolutely the best.
Yeah, 2 quick anecdotes. One, a few years ago we had a student, I haven't asked his permission to share this story, so I'll just call him Bill. And Bill, he really struggled with this desire to get good grades. And he said to himself, the reason I'm here really is just to try and learn well, not just to get good grades. Good grades and learning they can be 2 very different things. You can get really good grades and then a year later don't remember anything from class. You can get a B and a year later you've really imbibed what the class is about. So he would, whenever he got his paper back, he'd never look at it. He was married, so he'd show it to his wife, and he said, don't tell me what the grade is, but read the comments to me and let me know if there's any way I can improve and learn better in terms of what I'm doing. That was a pretty radical approach to making sure he was focused on learning and not just on the grade. But that's what he did to try and fight that desire for the 4.0. Second anecdote, sometimes as a faculty, we'll ask ourselves this question. When we're at graduation and we see a student walk across the stage and we think, yes, that student got it. That's a student we'd want to hold up as a model student. What is it about that student that makes them stand out? And not once over the years has a faculty member ever mentioned a GPA. What do you think we talk about instead? Character. 1 Corinthians 13, of course, is one of the most well-known chapters in the Bible about love, and it says, if I have the knowledge to understand all mysteries, there's someone who gets a 4.0, but I don't have love, what am I? I'm nothing. So just know at the end of the day, as you're walking across the stage, the Lord doesn't say, well done, good and 4.0 student, well done, good and even successful student. He says, well done, good and what? Faithful student. And that a huge part of faithfulness is not just learning up here, but asking the Lord constantly, move that into here so that it comes out here.
Thank you. One thing I love during these conversations is that I get to have you guys all have, close seats, but I have a front row seat to faculty getting to share their heart about their students, and I'm not tearing up, but I could if I wanted to. So that's pretty cool. So I'd like to turn our conversation a little bit for the last portion here. A lot of what we've been talking about has been dealing with structures of shame and inadequacy that need healing within us, but sometimes we face situations where we can feel inadequate, not because of our own abilities, but because we are in maybe social or situations where we don't look like everyone else. It might be as a woman in seminary. It might be as a racial minority. Maybe you are a first-generation Canadian? You could be. Yeah. Okay. Hi, Brendan. Maybe you're a first-generation college student, so you don't have the family knowledge passing on into grad school. Maybe you're an international student facing all the challenges of coming into a new culture and learning not only the expectations of I don't know, everywhere there's expectations, right? But also how academia works, how to write a paper in the U.S., which is different than other parts of the world. There can be so many hurdles that are crossed. We received one question from an attendee before the event began. She went ahead and emailed us. One of her experiences was as a woman who was deeply passionate about theology, struggling to feel like she could freely engage in conversations with other people who were deeply passionate about theology because they tended to be men in her social circles, and there was concern about would she be seen as being interested in theology or interested in men, or being seen as some sort of threat or outsider in her situation. So I wanted to give us an opportunity to address when someone feels an imposter, not because of necessarily completely interior or personal feelings of inadequacy, but also when they are in contexts where they are made to feel like imposters. So these pressures can feel heavy, they can be isolating. So what do you want your students who may have experiences like these to know in your classroom? If you could sit them down one-on-one and look them straight in the eye, what would you want to tell them about why they belong?
Sure, I'll start. I think part of it, as I mentioned it earlier with respect to kind of race, and you could use gender as well. Yesterday I was in an online class where it was very similar to a person of another cultural background, and she had presented kind of her perspective and saying, Dr. Kim, did you take this other perspective of where she was coming from? What I appreciate about the fact that she was, a little bit sheepish to want to express kind of that particular concern, my response was, first of all, thank you for sharing your heart with respect to that. And secondly was just an appreciation to be able to say, we need your voice. Because your voice adds to kind of the perspectives of, again, kind of God's beautiful world. And kind of similar to that, I guess that particular setting in which we sometimes struggle to say, do I belong? And again, I'm preaching this to myself as well. Just simply saying is, all of our voices are needed to be able to clearly see everything that kind of God has created. I'll give the anecdote that I've used before. It's actually in video form. I'll just quickly illustrate it. I've done it in a teaching, but there's a Google ad commercial where a pianist is at two different pianos. One is monotuned to where every single key is tuned to the same tune, and the other is just a regular piano. And the pianist is playing both tunes the same on the same piano, right? Or two different pianos. And you can obviously tell the difference because one's very flat and monotone, and the other is just brilliant because it's a masterpiece. And the commercial ends by saying, not the same, better together. And I think sometimes with respect to even things like voices, we lose that understanding that when we think about how God created the world from all those different perspectives, especially understanding the imago Dei, the image of God, and how we bear God's image, all that is necessary for us to see it clearly. So I would just encourage that student, not to say that what I often will end there is to say we don't want to hear your voice or see your words. We need to hear it. And just to encourage that contribution is extremely important to our understanding of how God created us.
Thanks, Robert. This feels like a little bit of a personal question for me. I graduated in 2007 on this campus, which I loved being here, still do. But being a female in what felt like a majority male context was hard. And I often felt like I shouldn't speak, or I needed to be careful, or I needed to wait, be a bit demure. And we had a professor who sort of caught on to that and said to me, Sabrina, in Christ, there is no Greek or Jew, male or female. And because of our identity in the Lord, and that back in creation, it says that both male and female were made in the Lord's image. We are equal. And we need your voice. We need all the voices of the women on campus. And I often get female students who come to my office expressing some of that, depending on, although I do have to say I want to pat Covenants back a little bit. This place has changed in the last 10 years. The female students report to me that we have a much more open campus, which I just am so thankful to the Lord for. So when a student is sitting across from me, I say to them, tell me more about the way that you feel marginalized. Tell me more about your experience, and then let me remind you who you are in Christ, and that there is no Greek or Jew, male or female. We all have our identity in him, and that's where our dignity comes from.
A couple different thoughts. First, to the person, whoever it was that asked the question of the scribe, I thought immediately of Ski, my wife. And Ski, when it comes to learning theology, she's like a puppy getting its ears scratched. I mean, she just loves it. She could just sit there for hours. We met at seminary, and she would be up till all hours of the morning talking theology, usually, as the question asker implied, usually with guys. And probably not every guy felt comfortable doing that, but she found some that were, and so she just went for it. She plundered the goods, as it were. And I just encourage you all to do the same. Just plunder the goods while you're here. Women students, often in class, I'll try to take time at some point to say, please know that office hours are there just as much for you as they are for anyone else. Because I've had women students over the years say, yeah, I wasn't quite sure, I felt funny. Please don't, come on in. All the profs, we would love to see you. We value you being here. The other thing I would say is that I guess I'd want to normalize how many people feel the imposter syndrome in one way or another. Several years ago, I was leading a covenant group on campus. There were 7 people in the group. And a few weeks into the semester, all first semester students, I asked this question: how many of you feel as though everyone else in your classes belongs here in a way that you don't? And out of the 7, guess how many raised their hand? All 7, that's right. Now, you could assume, boy, Jay, you just got the loser group that year, you know, but no, that wasn't it at all. This is such a common feeling. And so even if you're feeling that way, I would want you to know, one thing I'd say to you is, you are definitely not alone. You are in the majority if you are feeling that way in your first semester here, your first year here, your degree here at Covenant Seminary. That's just a very common feeling. And part of it comes, this will pick up on a comment you made earlier, Sabrina. I'll say it a bit differently. Part of it comes because what we end up doing is comparing our normal life to other people's highlight reels. A lot of times those feelings of insecurity come because we're comparing our normal life to other people's highlight reels. You know, we're looking at them in their area of, for me, this is when I go to an academic conference and I go and attend a paper and it's something in Old Testament. I'm an Old Testament prof, right? I should know Old Testament. I go to this paper and this person's going like 15 miles deep about something I've never even thought of. And I can come away just feeling like, oh, what am I doing teaching? But then I have to remember that person only has 2 or 3 wells that go 15 miles deep. You know, I've got mine. I just happen to be looking at his or hers right now. And so not to compare yourself to other people's highlight reels, because you always will end up the loser on that end of the equation if that's what you do.
Thank you very much. At this point, I'd like to open it up to all of your questions. And I'm going to ask one of my Scribe consultants, there we go, to be a microphone gopher. Let's see if we have a second microphone. Maybe not, so this will be the one. When you do ask a question, if you could make sure that you speak it entirely into the mic, because we are video recording and there are people streaming online, just so that everyone will be able to hear and will be able to hear. Yeah, so questions?
Okay, well, I have one. So, as you were talking, Dr. Sklar, I was thinking of my feelings of inadequacy, maybe in thinking of like, for me in particular, but I can see how this could be the case for counseling students too. The vocation that we're training for as like a very difficult task in, you know, like caring for people's souls or caring for people through things that we've never been through, and yeah, just feeling like unprepared, no matter how much preparation, how much reading, how much, you know, experience I might get while I'm here, still feeling like the task will seem insurmountable when I'm actually kind of thrown into the fire. So just kind of answering to that feeling and sentiment. Any of you guys?
I'll just start. Yeah, so I would encourage you, like similar to the analogy I gave with respect to my daughter, the type of incremental change that she's having and seeing, she doesn't see it on a day-to-day basis. And I see it much, for example, in our same view of sanctification, you know, how God is working in and through us to make us more and more to the image of his son. On a day-by-day basis, we tend not to be able to see that measure of growth. And yet when we kind of look at it year over year, or perhaps even decades over decades, we see kind of his hand of preparation and faithfulness in the midst of all of that. So much in the same way, kind of when you're getting in the thick of it, or, you know, third declension downs, as Jay had mentioned, right? We don't see the end picture, but there comes a moment, usually, and I say this just in terms of encouragement, that the long view is all of this gets summed up and added to a point where you're like, oh, it makes sense. You may not see it now, but God is depositing all these things within you to adequately prepare you for the task at hand. And so to believe that he who has called you is also faithful to prepare you accordingly in that way. Would be my encouragement.
Romans 8, nothing can separate us. So even if you're not prepared, even if you're standing in the fire and you have no idea what it takes and you have no answers, even if, God still loves you. Even if. That's all I got.
I think on the one hand, very practically, if you're a counseling student, for example, you'll have a lot of reps before you leave with very experienced counselors who are helping you to make sure you're understanding the basic things you need to do. When you get out there, you'll have a supervisor. So you're not out there on your own if you're training to be involved in pastoral ministry. Again, you want to go to a place where if you don't feel ready to be a senior pastor, you don't step into that role. You step into a role that your training here has prepared you for, and to be okay with that. To be okay recognizing, oh, yeah, I'm not a senior pastor with 20 years of experience. I'm a 28-year-old seminary grad who's helped with a youth group. All right, that impacts where I can go, what I can do, that kind of thing. So practically, there are those kinds of things to keep in mind. Not impractically, but at the same time, also to delight in the fact that the Lord loves to use the weak. And there are times, I remember once where I went to seminary, we were near Salem, Massachusetts, and Halloween there is just this huge event because there are more witches that live there, I think, than in any other part of the country. And so some of us would go to try and share the gospel that night. And I remember going there, and I had just a horrible week spiritually. I just felt so ill-prepared for going in and sharing the gospel. And I remember thinking, I am just so excited to see what the Lord is going to do, because I just know he's going to use me in some way tonight, because I won't be able to take a shred or ounce of glory. And sure enough, that night, I'm not an evangelist. That's not my gift. And that night, I just had this great chance to pastor this person I met in Salem, Massachusetts. And I just came away thinking, praise God, he delights to use the weak to shame the strong. And so, in the midst of your inadequacy, just remember, actually, I'm perfectly poised now for the Lord to use me.
Hey, I would wonder what you all would say to or for someone who has a tendency or temptation to intentionally other themselves in situations. So, someone who comes to the campus and looks at what they are, whether gender, race, etc., and intentionally says, I don't belong, and I'm going to make sure I don't belong. I'm going to intentionally separate myself because I feel safer when, over here, rather than becoming a part of the group or being a part of whatever ministry or whatever, always feeling like I have to separate myself for whatever reason because I'm always different.
I'm really glad you asked that question because it gives the counselor and me a chance to talk about attachment. But as you were asking that question, I was immediately thinking that person is protecting themselves. You knew that already, right? They're using some sort of way to keep distance so that they can't get hurt again. And so I wouldn't want to say very much to them. I'd want to listen. And I want to listen to how that helps them. I want to listen to what they're hoping it will do, and then gently and slowly using the relationship being built help point out to them that that thing that they're doing to keep people away, whatever that is actually defeating what their heart is really longing for, which is to be known and to be connected and to belong. And when we have that imposter syndrome, what we really do want is belonging. We want to know that we're enough. We want to know that we belong. And so somebody who's intentionally staying outside and other is terrified of being let down again, and maybe terrified of belonging because belonging has been something bad in the past, and we have to really go slowly and pay attention to that. So I wouldn't say very much. I'd want to listen a lot.
I could say a lot to this, but I won't. I will just use a couple of stories, just because. Actually, I'll give you one resource. There's I don't know the author's name right now, but Why All the Black Kids Sit Together at the Cafeteria Table is the name of the book. It's a great read in terms of just getting a little bit to this idea of otherness. And I think to that respect, there's a certain level, I think, if you try to understand the person, as Sabrina had mentioned, it is important just to be a person who can listen and try to understand why they're doing what they're doing with respect to the question of other, which I think is important. As one who is in the other, who sometimes sees aspects of that, I'm challenging those in the other category sometimes to be able to say, you're able to, or you're lacking some opportunity to embrace kind of the larger sense of the broader community by withdrawing. And so, but I think it's appropriate in terms of the types of conversations that you have. So again, here's the anecdote. So I was at a Missouri Presbytery meeting. There's only 3 Asian Americans, I think, in the entire Missouri Presbytery. So long story short, we're all in different parts of the room in the meeting, somewhat intentionally on purpose, but there was a break. And so during the break, we happened to all sit together. Okay. Now, what was fascinating was the 3 of us, as we sat there together, I said, I felt a little strange. One person was like, yeah, I felt that tension too. Like, I felt like people were looking at us and saying, why are all the 3 Asian guys sitting together at this meeting? And then the last guy, and this is just his truthful remarks, he's a little bit more brash. He's like, I won't say what he said, but he said, screw that, right? He's like, when will there ever be a time in which, you put 3 other people in majority culture where people are asking the same question? And so as you begin to kind of understand, I think, why the other is what the other is, it's become somewhat important to try to do a deeper dive with respect to that. And as complicated as that is, that we lean into the gospel to be able to say, there is no other in the gospel. I think what Sabrina had mentioned earlier, right? And so how do we befriend all the others, and those in particular that want to step into those margins as much as we can?
Great. Do we have any? I think we have time for one more.
Hi. This is probably like an origin question. There's an assumption here that we all understand what imposter syndrome is, and my question is, where did it come from? Where did imposter syndrome come from, and why do so many of us experience it? And all of us in here can be like, yeah, I know what that's like. But my question is why?
The historical background of the concept is, I just happened to print it out. Why? I don't know. I guess this is why. So the term came around in 1978. 2 psychologists were studying this experience of inadequacy that they found very common among high-achieving professional women. And then I didn't write their names down. I think it's Clance and Imes, I think.
Suzanne Imes and Pauline Klein.
Pauline Klein and Suzanne Imes. Okay. Thank you. So they continued their work, and other people continued building on their work. And by the mid-'80s, it was pretty clear that this was not only something experienced by high-achieving professional white women, but this was something that basically across the world, across age groups, across professions and vocations, across gender and race, that this was not by any means an uncommon feeling of inadequacy. We know it's associated with perfectionism, as we've touched on today, with anxiety, with depression. So it's not something that we want to sweep under the rug or think, well, this is just my own thing, I don't have to deal with it. one hope that I have as you all walk out of here today is that you're thinking about not only how you might deal with these feelings for yourself, but also how you might speak to those around you who, even if they don't tell you, I don't always feel adequate. Like, how do you speak to your classmates in a way that's going to build them up and equip them to approach their next assignment, to ask the next question in class? That's my highest hope for today, is that you start thinking about how to serve one another through this process. So I'm going to hand this off and continue this discussion about the origins of imposter syndrome. So that's where the word imposter syndrome came from, 1978. Obviously, it didn't start in 1978. So why do we feel this way?
I think it's a great question, and I think in some ways we could put it in the context of a whole bunch of other questions. We could have had a seminar today that was on asking the question, why do so many of us deal with unrighteous anger? And almost everyone would be able to say, yeah, I know what it's like to deal with unrighteous anger. Or we could have had a seminar based on the question, why is it that we experience feelings of jealousy? And almost everyone in the room would be able to say, yeah, I know what it is to experience feelings of jealousy. And with each one of those, we could say, well, why? Where's the origin come from? And my answer would be that as fallen, broken human beings, there's something in the DNA of our fallenness that we all experience these different feelings of unrighteousness, actions of unrighteousness that manifest themselves in all sorts of different ways. And some people truly do not struggle with anger. They're the exception, but some people truly do not struggle with jealousy. And some people truly don't struggle with the imposter syndrome. They're just always so thankful for other people's gifts, and yeah, I hate those people. I mean, but it's something, I think, that's just rooted in us as fallen creatures, that it is so easy for us to seek our sense of belonging and self in being better than others, or at least as good as them. And when we don't perceive that, it leads to all these different feelings. So that's how I would think about the origins. I don't know what my colleagues here would say.
The only thing I would add is, I'll go quick, is I think from a Genesis 3 perspective, it's that idea that we're hiding, right? And so I think even the idea of, so rooted in our understanding of guilt and shame with respect to the fall. And then I'm going to actually echo something that, so prior to that Genesis 2, there's the indictment on our human condition. So since we're really big on the idea of the creation culture, our creation piece too, there's that covenant, prior to that, it's this idea that we're not meant to be alone. And one of the, I think, cool things for at least, our stories where so much of our ability to get over it was actually found in this understanding of the sense of community, right? And so I would just encourage as well. So that, part of the root, in my opinion, kind of lies in that Genesis 3, we're hiding in guilt and shame. But then also to that, part of the restoration piece, or the redemptive piece, is how community really helps us understand and be rooted in the gospel to overcome pieces of this as well.